So next up, we have Professor Sara Heller. Sara is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Michigan, and will be discussing her research on youth summer jobs programs. So let's welcome to the stage, Sara.
Okay, so I'd like to start by asking you to imagine that you're a policymaker at the state level, in charge of a big state, let's say California, and your charge is to implement social policy that's going to help the life outcomes of young people. So one thing you're thinking about doing is reducing class sizes, right? And so you've heard about this, you're thinking about it, you're unsure, you read this fantastic, well-executed, rigorous randomized control trial from some schools in Tennessee that shows that, in fact, when you shrink class size, kindergarten kids learn more. And in fact, there's been some follow-on studies that suggest there's all sorts of other later life outcome improvements as well. Right, so you feel good about this policy. You say, yes, I'm going to implement this in California, statewide, scale it up. Right, and so you actually do it. You shrink class sizes in all of California. Researchers follow what you're doing. And what they find is that the impacts of what you did look nothing like the original study. Right? And moreover, they can sort of explain why, because what happened when you had to shrink so many class sizes is you had to hire so many more teachers that it ended up hard to find well-qualified teachers. And so the change in teacher quality actually sort of pushed against the change in class size. So this is very disappointing as a policymaker, but it's not a rare problem. In fact, I have all sorts of examples here, and this is just a few, of cases where we have some original small RCT that looks very promising, then you try to move it to a different setting or scale it up and replicate it, and it doesn't work as well. And there's lots of reasons. Some of it is about the staffing challenges. Some of it can be about implementation fidelity. Some of it can be that you end up serving a different population, and that population actually responds differently. Some of it is that when you do something at a large scale, other parts of the system adjust in ways that sort of push against that initial impact, right? And this is a challenge for what we think of as evidence-based policy, because what does it mean to use evidence-based policy when evidence in one place doesn't actually apply to another, right? And so this is sort of a hard problem. And so what I want to do today is to tell you about one success story of an intervention that does seem to replicate and scale pretty successfully, and a little bit about the story of how we know. So the program is Summer Youth Employment Programs, or SYEPs. These are municipal programs. They offer typically 6 to 8 week jobs to young people over the summer in government, in nonprofit, and private sector firms. And they're often accompanied by some kind of enrichment curriculum. That can be social emotional learning, it can be workforce development, it can be financial literacy. There's a huge variety. So when I started thinking about these programs a little over a decade ago now, we knew almost nothing about whether or how they worked, even though they had been around for a pretty long time. So let me take you back to Chicago in the run-up to 2012, when I was a graduate student in Chicago. So early on, I had approached the Daley administration, asking them if they were interested in having their summer programs evaluated. And their answer was basically thanks, but no thanks. Then Mayor Rahm Emanuel got elected, and he charged his staff with the following. He said, I don't want to be spending money on things that we think maybe kind of sort of are likely to work. I want to know if they work. Go find out. And so this is music to my young graduate student in search of a dissertation ears. And fortunately for me, the commissioner of the Department of Family and Support Services at the time, Evelyn Diaz, is both a champion of evidence production and was in charge of the department that ran Chicago's summer programming. So she looped back with me, and we started working together to develop something, sort of carve out a piece of the larger Chicago programming that we could evaluate. And because violence was such a pressing problem in Chicago at the time as now, we focused on choosing eligibility criteria, so sets of young people who were in high schools that were located in neighborhoods affected by violence, and sort of building a curriculum that we thought would sort of help reduce violence as well. Because these programs are always oversubscribed, there's always more interest than you have money for slots to serve, we could set it up as a randomized controlled trial. That involved a lot of convincing of the local nonprofits who are implementing to do that, but I think they were fairly compelled by the fact that it's actually a very fair way to allocate a limited resource as opposed to nepotism or something else. and that sets us up to do a good, rigorous study. So I set out working on all of the data sharing agreements, so we could do this at a pretty low cost to match all of the applicants to administrative data. So school records, arrest records, employment records. That's a year of my graduate career spent arguing with lawyers. But it paid off in the end, because what we found out is that, in fact, this program reduced violent crime arrests by 42%. And that happened not just over the summer, so it's not just a question of an incapacitation effect of keeping young people busy. They were taking something with them through the following year. Now, we could have just stopped, right, and rested on our laurels and said, what a success we are. But we had more questions, and we knew about all of these cases where you try something again and it doesn't work. And so what we did over the course of the next few years is design more studies. In 2013, our question was whether, if it worked for this sort of general population living in high-violence neighborhoods, could it work for people who are even more disconnected, who had sort of already had direct contact with the legal system? And in 2015, we asked, does it have to be exactly this program? Can we change it? So the enrichment curriculum changed, the amount of mentorship changed, trying to save a little bit of money, and a few other changes. And I will say, I was not super optimistic about these changes. So especially in 2013, I told Commissioner Diaz, look, we've tried a lot of different employment programs for this kind of disconnected, justice-involved population, and the history is not very good. I don't think the literature supports it, but it's an empirical question, so let's find out. I was totally wrong, right? So in fact, we replicated this pretty big drop in violent crime arrests. And even in 2015, when lots of other stuff changed, we saw a big decline in involvement in the legal system. Now, even this is not the end of the story. I graduated, thankfully, got a job, moved to Penn, and in Philadelphia, Mayor Nutter called me to say, hey, why is Chicago getting all the love? We also have a summer jobs program. Can you help us understand what the effects of this program are? And so we designed a sort of multi-year lottery study there as well, and found that indeed, both arrests and incarceration fall in Philadelphia as well. Now, lest I leave you with the impression that this is about me and the magical fairy dust that I sprinkle on my evaluations, let me also tell you about other sets of researchers who were investigating other summer jobs programs completely independently in other cities. So 2 of them are here, I think, Judd Kessler and his co-authors in New York, and Alicia Monastiro and her co-authors in Boston. And they also found big declines in these same kinds of behavior. And in fact, the New York study is big enough that they could even detect a decline in mortality over multiple years, consistent with this idea that young people were staying out of violence involvement. So you might look at this and say, okay, not all of these numbers are exactly identical, not all of these outcomes are exactly identical. That's true, there's variation. And we've done some more work since then thinking about why. In this case, it turns out part of the explanation is that in the case of SYEPs, it's the young people who are at the highest risk of these negative behaviors who seem to respond the most. So in programs where the eligibility criteria are such that people are at very low risk of violence, you're not going to reduce violence very much because there's not very much room to move. So that's part of the story. But overall, I look at these numbers and I think, wow, across contexts, across settings, across implementation types, across program variation, right? So in Philadelphia and New York, everybody is eligible to apply if you're of the right age. There's a lot more variation in what the program actually looks like. Across all of this variation, it is pretty clear that SYEPs consistently are keeping kids out of crime and violence. So that's great. Not all of the results are that consistent. Right? So when we look at education, Alicia has found really positive impacts on education in Boston. None of the other cities where it's been evaluated have found those improvements. Right? So everywhere else, it's sort of smaller null results on education. So those are a little bit mixed. Policymakers often think about summer jobs programs as a jobs program, right? That it's going to improve future employment. It turns out it doesn't, at least not on average. Now, there are some subgroups who might benefit, and there might be some other things we can do. So Judd and I went back to New York to test what would happen if we added a letter of recommendation to the end of the program. And it turns out that providing that letter of recommendation actually does increase employment and earnings. And so that tells us a little bit about what's going on, that it seems like part of the story, at least, is that employers are very uncertain about the skills, the soft skills in particular, of young people. And so when you give them a way to understand what those skills look like, they hire more of the people who are ready for the job. Now, we might need something else to help people who are less ready for the job. So even with all of this research going on, there's plenty of open questions still, right? So we still want to understand a lot more about mechanisms. Is this about learning self-regulation skills? Is it about changes in peer exposure and time use? Is it about, what was the last thing I was going to tell you? Is it just about the income, right? There's lots of questions about mechanisms, about optimal targeting. So how much does it matter who your peers are? How much does the job matter or the job match matter with your own skills? There's lots of questions we could still answer. But I want to sort of close here by highlighting something that comes out of all of this research of what we've found, which is that as you sort of develop these researcher, practitioner, policymaker partnerships, the evidence is not just about answering these questions about what works. It actually helps people, right? So there's all of these examples where because we've generated all of this evidence, policymakers have been able to go to funders, including Magic Johnson up there, among others, and say, look, we have consistent estimates of what this is doing. You should fund more. And so there's been thousands and thousands and thousands of more young people who now have the opportunity to have their outcomes improved in this way because of the evidence base that we all together have generated. And for me as a researcher, this is an incredibly heartening reminder that evidence matters, right? That it can help generate not just the answer to important questions, but also positive change. So let me be upfront and wrap up here by saying it is hard to find examples like this where you sort of start small and see it, and then it seems to work lots of other places. There are not very many of them. But I hope one of the things that you will all take from the talk today is the importance of continuing to look, right? So to try to find things that aren't just interventions that work in a particular way, but that are approaches that can work in lots of ways, right? Because when you do that, when you invest in those partnerships, you sort of have a lot more flexibility in being able to implement something that is really evidence-based. Now, this is hard. Partly it's going to require, as Laura sort of talked about earlier, academics to value replication a little bit more than they actually do. That's hard. Getting academics to change their mind about anything is hard. And the partnerships are also hard, right? I've done a lot of them. I don't want to lie to you about that. Basically, everyone involved has to be willing to accept decisions that they would not otherwise make, right? And so there's a lot of compromise involved. It's difficult, but I think the payoff is really high, right? Because as we are able to find more approaches that work across settings, across contexts, across populations, we're going to be able to generate more cost-effective change. Thank you very much. So about 5 minutes for Q&A. So I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, I'm Bruce from the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Thank you for the presentation. It talks about summer job programs from a funder perspective or other NGOs who would like to do something like this. Sometimes it's hard to know how to put the specifics of the program design into implementation because it feels like it's like a model that has been tested. But you know, how to translate that into a program, say back in Philadelphia. Have you seen anything that have done that well in terms of explaining or documenting that, or just your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a real challenge. And I think there's sort of like two models in the world. One is where it's like, this is my program, and I'm going to manualize it, and this is what it looks like. And so I think if you have a program like that that has been well evaluated and is specific, creating a sort of manualized version has a very large payoff. People call me all the time about other work I've done and say, how do I do this? And I say, well, you have to go talk to the nonprofit that ran it because they have like a manualized version. So investing in, I think, ways to sort of manualize and help for very specific programs is useful. I think for the case of SYEPs, it doesn't have to be, right? What the evidence suggests is it doesn't have to be like a very specific kind of program, But that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter at all what you do, right? Like all of these have very similar elements, and I think in all of the places they've been studied, they get implemented with fairly high, if heterogeneous, quality, right? So I don't think you can just say, I'm gonna pay kids to dig this hole and then fill it back up, and now I've solved the violent crime problem in my city, right? Like that's probably not gonna work. And so, I mean, I think part of what would be useful in that case is for like these cities that have been through this, that have really reflected on their curriculum and what they're doing and have decades of experience, talk to each other and talk to new jurisdictions that want to start these kinds of programs. So I just talked to someone in the UK and they're wanting to start something like this and they just don't have anything like that. And I as a researcher can help a little bit in terms of like what I know, but there's so many details about like how do you actually operationalize this? How do you make sure paychecks go out on time? How do you build the relationships with employers and identify the right employers where it's going to be a productive relationship and they're not just going to get frustrated that kids don't know what they're doing? And so I think the answer is a little bit outside the kind of research that I do, but it's about really communication among implementers and sort of sharing best practices about things that we have seen work.
I'm Jen Durham from the U.S. Treasury. You mentioned this issue of one of the sort of components of a program. You talked about in one place where the eligibility criteria were very broad, it did show us big effect on violence. How do you think about the interaction between eligibility criteria, local officials that want to help as many people as possible, and evaluations that won't show an effect if the eligibility criteria are so broad? So in your conversations with local policymakers, how do they weigh those trade-offs? And what do you think the role of one, to help as many people as possible versus an evaluation that's trying to show positive results?
Have definitely been parts of those conversations, right? Where it's just like universality is always the answer. And I think one way that I think about it, and it's helped by the fact that we have so much variation in evidence. So like step one is creating the evidence with lots of different populations so we know something about who to target and who's going to respond. But I think the other thing that I try to encourage policymakers to do is to decide what outcomes matter most to them, right? Because it's not like the universal programs here didn't do anything. They just maybe didn't reduce violence as much because the kids weren't involved in as much violence. And so are you wanting your program to really target violent crime? Then that sort of leads to one set of eligibility criteria that we should think about. There's still some unanswered questions about whether we need other peers who are less involved there too, right? So there's future questions about that. Are you really thinking about this as wanting to be an employment program? Well, it's not doing that on average, so then we should really look at who are the subgroups who respond, some of the things about sort of skill signaling that Judd and I have learned. But it involves a decision up front of getting people to articulate what the outcomes are that they really care about and sort of focusing on that. And so I guess my answer is just having an honest conversation about what are the things you're trying to do and making sure you're sort of focused on doing those things and not trying to do everything, because nothing is going to do everything. I think we have 1 minute left. This is probably the last question.
So first, I wanted to really thank you. I know your work very well. We talk about it a lot at JPAL. We also talk, I had a similar experience watching you to listening to the discussion on match or high-dose tutoring yesterday, which is, wow, these are things we talk about a lot, and yet I find it so educational and inspiring hearing the people who actually do the work talk about it. So thank you. So I have a question that may be unfair, but you
the best kind.
You started with this example of a scale-up that failed basically because there was a limited supply of the necessary input, in that case, teachers. So I guess the question part is, in the cities where this has been implemented successfully, has it basically been done at scale, or are there hundreds of thousands of more at-risk youth in those cities who could likely benefit from the program? And if so, are you concerned at all about, are you trying to scale up? Are you concerned about the scarce input factor? Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer sort of depends on how you define scale. Let me give a good academic answer. It depends. Right, so in the case of Chicago, the program tripled in size over the course of when we studied it. So it sort of went from, I think, like 8 to 14 providers and all sorts of other things. So there was at least sort of some scale there, but it was still a very small part of their broader summer programming. And there's still for sure lots of other young people who seemed like they could benefit who haven't. In Philadelphia, there's certainly a limited number of slots. So there's probably more people who could benefit than are available slots. That said, historically, they often end up with a few extra slots, right? And so it's not like you could probably generate more demand if you wanted to, but it's not like there's lots more demand, and it's a universal program. New York is the same way, right? They serve now, what is it, like 70,000 young people a year? That's a big program. Are there more young people who look similar who could benefit? Sure. But I think the fact that we've seen it work in these sort of like universal eligibility, pretty large programs suggests at least it works at a much larger scale than we started at. I agree. I think if you kept going, you would probably run out of employers who are willing to sort of invest in youth development and other things. So I don't want to pretend like it's infinitely scalable. But even at that point, then you're probably getting to populations that benefit a little bit less. And so for sure, there is some sort of like optimal scale that we should think about too. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. It's me again, in case you missed me. We are now going to commence a break for 10 minutes, and then we're going to regroup at 10:55. So grab some snacks, grab some coffee, and we'll see you for Marcella's session that kicks off at 10:55.